In 1892, Grover Cleveland became the first US president to win non-consecutive presidential terms. That is, he lost his first re-election bid only to come back 4 years later to win the presidency again. Rematches between presidential candidates have happened several times through the course of US history, but only twice has the result been different from the first encounter. In 1828, Andrew Jackson defeated the sitting president John Quincy Adams after having lost to him in 1824. And in 1892, Grover Cleveland defeated Benjamin Harrison after having lost to him in 1888. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we continue our coverage of US presidential elections starting in 1872. Hillary Clinton was not the first woman US presidential candidate. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull became the first female candidate for the US presidency. Woodhull was a radical social campaigner and one of the first female stockbrokers. The irony? She herself was ineligible to vote in the presidential election. Meanwhile, on the presidential front, the sitting president, Ulysses S. Grant, had upset the liberal Republicans within his party, mainly because he had resorted to nepotism in his civil service appointments and his approach to the reconstruction of the South. The liberal faction within the Republicans wanted lesser intervention by the government and a return to a gold and silver currency standard. So they fielded New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley as their presidential candidate. However, on November 29, 1872, after the popular vote had been cast, but before the Electoral College votes, Greeley died. As a result, electors who had previously committed to Greeley voted for 4 different candidates for president. Greeley himself received 3 posthumous electoral votes, which were disallowed by Congress. With this development, Ulysses S. Grant easily won back his presidency, beating his nearest Democratic rival, Thomas Hendricks, by 286 to 42. And unfortunately, Victoria Woodhull did not get any electoral votes. The election of 1876 turned out to be very similar to the year 2000 Bush-Gore election. Since the Civil War, the Republicans had held a stranglehold on the presidency. But the last term of Ulysses S. Grant had been beset by scandals like the Credit Mobilier scandal and allegations of corruption. The Democrats won control of the House in 1874 and were on an upswing in 1876. On election day, Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden led his Republican rival Rutherford Hayes by 260,000 votes and appeared all set to win the presidency. However, 3 states were in doubt with 19 electoral votes between them: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The Republican Rutherford Hayes and his team were ready to concede when a New Hampshire Republican, William Chandler, observed that if Hayes were awarded every one of the doubtful votes, he would defeat Tilden 185 to 184. And all of a sudden, both parties claimed victory in these 3 states. After a lot of maneuvering in Congress, on January 29, 1877, Congress created an electoral commission to break the deadlock. And while the commission was deliberating, a lot of Republican allies of Hayes engaged with moderate Southern Democrats in secret negotiations to get them to sway towards Hayes. After months of deliberations and several 8-7 split votes, the presidency was awarded to Rutherford Hayes on March 4, 1877. The Northern Democrats were not too happy with this development and dubbed Hayes his fraudulency, However, after taking over the presidency, the Democrats were able to convince Rutherford Hayes to withdraw federal troops from the states still under military occupation, and thereby ending the era of Reconstruction of the South. And as a result of this, the Democrats came to dominate what came to be known as the Solid South. Yes, Democrats were solid in the South, and the election of 1880 showed this sectional divide across the country very clearly. President Rutherford Hayes had committed to only one presidential term, so James A. Garfield was the Republican nominee in 1880. On the Democrat side, Samuel Tilden was the preferred candidate because the Democrats felt that he needed to be given a fair chance at the presidency to reverse his controversial loss 4 years earlier. Samuel Tilden, however, refused to be a candidate, and the Democrats ended up fielding General Winfield Scott Hancock, who was a Union commander during the Civil War. Garfield won the election 214 to 155, but the Democrat Hancock carried every state that belonged to the Confederacy. But only 4 months into office, on July 2, 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot twice in the railroad station while on his way to a family vacation in New England. One of the bullets pierced his back and lodged behind his pancreas. And unfortunately, that was in an era when the practice of medicine was largely oblivious of the role played by germs in illness and disease. A parade of doctors poked and prodded Garfield's wound in search of the bullet, completely unmindful of the need for sterility. Even a new invention by Alexander Graham Bell, the metal detector, was brought in to aid the search for the bullet. And as a result, Garfield died 2 months later on September 19, 1881, from blood poisoning and a fatal heart attack. His vice president, Chester Arthur, took over as president. But Chester Arthur failed to be nominated as the Republican candidate in 1884. The Republicans nominated James G. Blaine, the House representative from Maine, for the presidency. The Democrats nominated the governor of New York, Grover Cleveland. The primary issue during the election of 1884 was that of tariffs. Republicans by now were pro-big business, so they supported tariffs. The Democrats, on the other hand, felt that the tariffs impacted the livelihood of farmers, so they were staunchly against it. And while the tariffs issue was debated, both sides engaged in serious mudslinging against each other. The Republican, James G. Blaine, had been accused of financial impropriety in the past, but Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, had carried a very clean image of himself. But this clean image suffered a major setback when the Republicans charged that the Democratic candidate had fathered a child out of wedlock some 10 years earlier. And suddenly, they started dancing to the slogan, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" To everyone's surprise, Grover Cleveland actually did not deny the allegations. He admitted that he had had an affair with the child's mother and had agreed to provide financial support when she had told him about the child, though he was uncertain whether the child was really his. So the Democrats ramped up their mudslinging of Blaine with their slogan, "Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine." In the end, Grover Cleveland won the presidency by an electoral vote margin of 219 to 182, becoming the first Democrat to win the presidency since 1856 and the first in the post-Civil War era. The issue of tariffs continued to stay center stage in the elections of 1888, and Grover Cleveland faced the Republican candidate Benjamin Harrison in the presidential race. Ultimately, Cleveland garnered about 100,000 more votes than Harrison, but lost in the Electoral College by a margin of 168 to Harrison's 233. The election of 1892, though, saw a rematch between Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland, and this time Grover Cleveland came roaring back to win the presidency by an electoral vote margin of 277 to 145. And in the process, Grover Cleveland became the first president in US history to win two non-consecutive presidential terms. Now, one thing to point out here is that primaries from each party to nominate the presidential candidate did not come into effect till the early 20th century. Prior to that, for most of the 19th century, the presidential candidate used to be elected at the national convention of the specific party. So it was a mix of members of Congress and delegates from each state who voted for a specific candidate, and sometimes the voting went through several rounds before the final candidates for president and vice president were selected. Now, at the time of the presidential election of 1896, the country was in an economic depression that had started in 1893, and the monetary policy had seen a division across political parties. There were those that favored the gold standard, and there were those who favored free silver as a type of currency inflation to help alleviate the depression. Mostly Republicans and the Democratic supporters of President Grover Cleveland were in favor of the gold standard. But Southern and Western Democrats and some members of the People's Party wanted a free silver monetary policy. The Republicans nominated William McKinley, who favored the gold standard, and the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan, who endorsed free silver as a monetary policy. Ultimately, the Republican McKinley won the election, beating the Democrat Jennings Bryan by 271 to 176 electoral votes. And the year 1900 saw a rematch between McKinley and Jennings Bryan. But by now, McKinley had covered himself in glory in the Spanish-American War of 1898, which led to Spain ceding the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States in February of 1899, and Cuba became an independent nation. And McKinley's candidature was further enhanced by his new running mate, the governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a formidable debater and a powerful orator, traveled throughout the country and campaigned actively for McKinley. In the end, the rematch yielded the same result as the first encounter, and McKinley romped home with a 292 to 155 electoral vote margin. Unfortunately, less than a year into his second term, William McKinley was assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt took over as president. Coincidentally, McKinley too, like President Garfield, died of blood poisoning as his doctors were unable to locate the fatal bullet. The election of 1904 saw Teddy Roosevelt achieve a landslide victory with 336 electoral votes to 140 for the Democrat Alton B. Parker. Roosevelt had had an amazing stint as the president in the last 3 years, with a raft of policy goals such as the expansion of the national parks system, increase of American influence abroad, and also being actively involved in breakup of corporate monopolies. But soon after getting elected in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt announced that he would not be seeking a subsequent term in office. And in preparation for the election of 1908, Roosevelt threw his support behind his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. And the Democrats, in contrast, nominated William Jennings Bryan for the third time. Yep, Jennings Bryan was back after taking a break in the 1904 elections. Promising to continue the policies of Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft easily won the presidency, 321 electoral votes to 162. For the election of 1912, the Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson, who had served as the president of Princeton University and the governor of New Jersey. Woodrow Wilson ran on a progressive platform, even backing women's suffrage. And he won by a landslide, 435 electoral votes, to the nearest candidate, Teddy Roosevelt of the Progressive Party, who polled only 88 electoral votes. Whoa, wait. Wasn't Teddy Roosevelt a Republican? And hadn't he refused a re-election bid? Yes to both. But in 1912, frustrated with William Howard Taft, a group of Republicans led by Teddy Roosevelt had formed a progressive faction, and they intended on nominating Teddy Roosevelt for the presidency. But William Howard Taft was able to manipulate his way to the nomination, and frustrated with this, the progressives nominated Theodore Roosevelt as their candidate under the new party. And with this victory, Woodrow Wilson became the first Southern-born president after the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson had a good first stint as president, instituting tariff reform and creating the Federal Reserve System. But during the election of 1916, the achievement he touted the most was keeping the United States out of World War I. Woodrow Wilson was re-elected, though by a lot closer margin, 277 to 254, over his Republican rival, Charles Evans Hughes. By the election of 1920, though, the US had entered World War I, and Woodrow Wilson had negotiated the Treaty of Versailles without involving anybody from Congress. So he had upset members from both sides of the aisle. And despite his failing health, he was hoping to get nominated a third time. And because of that, his son-in-law and Treasury Secretary, William G. McAdoo, who was among the favorites to be nominated, could not publicly seek the nomination. In the end, the Democrats nominated the governor of Ohio, James M. Cox, as their presidential candidate, with a young 38-year-old Franklin Delano Roosevelt as his running mate. And Franklin Roosevelt, aka FDR, resigned his post as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to focus on the campaign. The Republicans nominated Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding as their presidential candidate, with Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge as his running mate. Since the country had just come out of World War I, Warren Harding's punchline was a return to normalcy. And the country, which was war-weary, gave Harding a thumping mandate. He won the presidency 404 electoral votes to Cox's 127. But with respect to the popular vote, the margin of his victory was 60.3% to 34.1%, which remains the widest differential in history to date. The Warren Harding administration, though, was mired in scandals, including the infamous Teapot Dome scandal. But Harding died suddenly in 1923, and his VP, Calvin Coolidge, ascended to the presidency. Coolidge focused on diligently rooting out the corruption in the administration and slowly restored integrity to the executive branch. His results were visible, and he was easily nominated for the presidency for the 1924 elections. The 1924 campaign is notable for its use of radio broadcasting of the political conventions and of party advertisements. Photojournalism was also used to record campaign actions. In the end, the Republican Calvin Coolidge easily won the presidency, beating his nearest Democratic rival, John W. Davis, by a margin of 382 electoral votes to 136. In August of 1927, President Calvin Coolidge unexpectedly announced that he would not seek a second term. There were many contentious issues at the time, prominent among them being the civil rights for African Americans and women. And the challenge for both parties was to find the right candidates who had a good mix of opinions on these issues. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover became the Republican candidate for presidency, whereas the Democrats chose four-term governor of New York, Al Smith. A large chunk of the campaign was conducted via radio and newsreels, and in the end, it was Herbert Hoover's Midwestern diction and rural roots that resonated with a great number of voters, giving him a landslide victory with 444 electoral votes to Al Smith's 87. From the Civil War through 1928, barring 2 terms each from Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, the Republicans had pretty much held the presidency. But in 1929, the country was hit with the Great Depression, and the entire political spectrum witnessed a dramatic shift. The Republicans renominated Herbert Hoover. The Democrats nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, who broke tradition and accepted the party's nomination in person. In his speech before the delegates, he said, quote, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people, end quote. Needless to say, the economic depression was the primary issue in the presidential campaign. Though FDR lacked specifics with respect to his New Deal, he was able to promise aid to farmers, public development of electric power, a balanced budget, and government policing of irresponsible private economic power. This resonated well with the voters, and FDR won the presidency 472 electoral votes to Herbert Hoover's 59. Now, up to the election of 1932, there used to be a 4-month gap between the elections and the inauguration of the new president. And during this 4-month period, after the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover tried to seek FDR's cooperation in stemming the economic crisis. But between the two, they were unable to find common ground. So as a result, by inauguration day of March 4, 1933, most banks had shut down, industrial production had fallen to about 56% of its 1929 level, 13 million wage earners were unemployed, and farmers were in dire straits. But in his inaugural address, FDR promised prompt and decisive action to millions of Americans listening on radios and throughout the country. And it is here that he asserted, this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and prosper, and concluding with the famous line, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which 2 states joined the Union after World War II? The last 2 additions to the Union were Alaska in January of 1959 and Hawaii in August of 1959. So the answer is C, Alaska and Hawaii. Question for the current episode. Only 3 presidents in history have won the presidency polling more than 500 electoral votes. Who are these 3 presidents? Are these A, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton? B, FDR, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Ronald Reagan? C, FDR, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan? Or D, Harry Truman, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Bill Clinton? Once again, which 3 presidents have won their presidency polling more than 500 electoral votes? Are these A, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton? B, FDR, Lyndon B. Johnson and Ronald Reagan, C. FDR, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, or D. Harry Truman, Lyndon B. Johnson and Bill Clinton? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. The next episode, being the last for the year, we'll digress from the presidential elections history and move on to a fun topic to cover a few bizarre and fantastic events from history. Events that include a botched operation of a government against wildlife. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.